Hi. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. For me, that is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. The Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning and the Connected Cities Lab, together with the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia and the Banksia Foundation, welcomes you to the Sustainable Development Goals, Climate Change and Cities Symposium. My name is Stephanie Butcher, Research Fellow at the Connected Cities Lab at the University of Melbourne. Joining us today is Theresa Williamson, Executive Director of Catalytic Communities, Brazil, who will be discussing the Sustainable Development Goals and urban planning for equity and climate resilience in our cities. Theresa Williamson, Ph.D., is a city planner and founding executive director of Catalytic Communities, or CatComm, an NGO working to support Rio de Janeiro's favelas through asset-based community development. CatComm produces RioOnWatch, an award-winning local-to-global favela news platform, and facilitates Rio's Sustainable Favela Network and Favela Community Land Trust Program. Theresa is an advocate for the recognition of the favela's heritage status and their residents' right to be treated as equal citizens. She received the 2018 American Society of Rio Prize for her contributions to the city, and the 2012 NAHRO Award for her contributions to the international housing debate. Theresa has many publications, including multiple book chapters and 4 op-eds in the New York Times. She has been cited in hundreds of publications and television. Previously, she received the 2005 Gil Chin Lim Award for Best Dissertation on International Planning, and CatComm received the 2006 Tech Museum Award for Technology Benefiting Humanity. Dr. Williamson earned her BA in Biological Anthropology from Swarthmore College and Ph.D. in City and Regional Planning from the University of Pennsylvania. You will have the chance to join a live Q&A with Dr. Williamson, Anna Hurleyman, Associate Professor and Assistant Dean Diversity and Inclusion of the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, and Shipra Narang, Chief of the Urban Practices Branch and Global Solutions Division, UN Habitat, at the symposium on Thursday, the 1st of October. We thank you for joining us today and welcome Theresa Williamson.
Thank you to the University of Melbourne, to the Architecture, Building and Planning faculty for inviting me to participate. Thank you to the Connected Cities Lab. My name is Theresa Williamson, and I'm Executive Director of Catalytic Communities, a nonprofit here in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, that works with the city's favela communities. I'm going to be talking about these communities today. That's going to be the focus of the presentation. I was invited to speak on urban planning and climate resilience for the urban poor. And what I'm going to be bringing is a perspective on how communities that we normally think of as marginal or precarious can actually be the source of sustainability in our cities in the future. So the talk I'm going to be giving, I'm calling it Favelas at the Vanguard, Rethinking Our Assumptions on Sustainable Cities. And because I'm bringing a perspective that's from very far away, I'm including a lot of images in this presentation and a lot of text. But note that I won't be lingering on the slides for very long, and some of them I'll just sort of briefly go over. So the presentation is available online at the link at the bottom of this slide. Please go for it when you get a chance. Go spend some more time on these images and feel free to contact me for more information. So to get started, I ask everyone here to take a look at this picture and tell me if you know what city this is an image for. This is the iconic image people associate with Rio de Janeiro. But actually, most people don't realize that the city of Rio was actually the largest slave port in world history, receiving 5 times more enslaved Africans than the entire United States. And slavery in Brazil lasted 60% longer than in the United States. And this history is absolutely critical to understanding the city and its favelas. And so I'm providing this brief background before I get into the sustainability of these communities going forward, because it's important to understand that they've been around for literally over 100 years. Rio was the federal capital of Brazil, and in late 1880s, 1890s was when the city was booming and growing fastest. And the very first favela was settled in 1897 in that context by soldiers who were promised land in the capital city of Rio. And they named the community where they settled when they weren't given that land, when they had to squat because they weren't paid by the government. They named that community Favela Hill. And the name favela simply is the name of this robust, shiny, resilient, spiny bush from the northeast of Brazil where they had served battle. So they named their community after this. And favelas have continued to evolve over 122, now 123 years of policies of neglect and repression have been the mainstay. And again, I'm not going to go through this slide in all detail, but it's important to understand that these communities are long-lived at this point. That they've been victimized essentially by repeated policies, cyclical policies of neglect and repression, insufficient investment, and essentially they've been kept precarious at some level throughout that history. The result is that today in Rio, we have 24% of the city's population, about 1.4 million people live in these communities. There are about 1,000 favela communities. And you can see them literally all over the city, dotting the landscape. In Rio, they're actually literally in the South Zone, which is the wealthy area, and the North Zone, which is the post-industrial working neighborhoods, in the West Zone, which is the newly booming regions. They're literally all over the city in the reds and oranges on this map. But really what they ultimately comes down to is that these communities that came out of slavery just a few years after abolition in Brazil, they're today the territorial manifestation of that legacy. And they provide essentially cheap labor in areas all over the city. And these communities are kept precarious through policies of neglect and repression. And this is why, and again, this talk is just gonna go on, sort of hint at different elements of a very complex city and a very complex story. But basically, this is why you have so much activism and organizing by residents of these communities today to try to get equal rights. These residents are holding up a sign that says favela residents are not at fault. So I'm gonna now go into sort of reintroducing favelas based on that history and understanding where they come from. I'm going to give you an introduction to what these communities actually are, which is very different typically from the way they're perceived or depicted in the media. But first, it's really important to understand the global historic context of these communities. We're not talking about something that's unique to Rio or Brazil. 1 in 3 people living in cities today lives in an informal settlement. Favelas are just our Brazilian term for these communities, which exist all over the world. And by 2050, the United Nations predicts nearly 1/3 of all humanity will live in urban informal settlements, because most of the cities in the world that are growing, and our generation, in your generation, and my generation, are communities that came out of, or communities that are surfacing as cities grow, as people move to cities in the developing world, and those governments don't have structure or don't develop the infrastructure for housing for the low-income residents who come to these areas. So they settle informally and they develop neighborhoods. Now, typically when we see media reports on these communities, especially in favelas in Brazil, they translate the term to one of these 4: squatters, slums, shanty towns, or even ghettos. I'm not going to go into each of these, but they're all inaccurate. None of them are accurate portrayals of favelas in Rio in 2020. There are a small proportion of people in favelas that live in slum conditions, or that are squatters in the sense that they don't have some sort of legal right to be where they are. It's just that they're kept precarious here. So for example, we have squatters' rights in the Constitution, but residents don't necessarily get a title. So they have rights, but they're hard to access. that kind of thing. So things are complex and complicated. They're definitely not squatters or slums anymore for the most part. And if they've been around then 123 years, how do you describe them? How do you define them? Well, we've encouraged people to use the term favela when they speak about these communities, because every country's context of informal settlements is very different. And what defines Rio's favelas, and probably informal settlements in most places, is essentially four things, none of which are objectively good or bad. They're neighborhoods that develop out of an unmet need for housing. So actually at their source, they're a solution. They're a solution for the lack of shelter. People create their own homes. There's no outside regulation, so the government isn't telling them how to build. They're established by residents, so every brick, every tile that's laid has somebody who lived there was the one who created it. There's a level of embedded history in these neighborhoods, which is significant. You can see the sewage system being built on the slide I'm currently showing you. And finally, they evolve based on culture and access to resources, jobs, knowledge. The city is, transforming all the time. Depending on where the favela you live in is, you may have access to different types of opportunities. You might have different types of leadership. And the result is an incredibly complex array of diverse neighborhoods. Put another way, favelas are affordable, informal, self-built, and unique. And we've been able to identify a number of qualities that urban planners like myself are looking to build into cities around the world that are almost intrinsic to some of these communities. And I won't go into, again, all of these right now, but essentially, as we build sustainable cities as urban planners, these are a list of the things we're trying to build into those cities. And they happen organically and naturally in most favelas. In the case of Rio, most of these communities were built near employment, so they live near work. They're low-rise, high density. They have shops. They don't need to leave the community for their basic needs. They build the houses based on need rather than luxury, and so on. There are sociocultural assets. There are urbanistic and economic qualities. These communities have so many different qualities that we don't normally think about when we think of, quote, slums. And you can see here a variety of images I'm going to show of different levels of development in these communities, different levels of urban infrastructure. Some have roads, some are alleys, some have very little investment from the government, different levels of service provision, like water, but also just the incredible variety of use of the environment because it's built by residents according to their needs. A huge, very strong social life, a lot of solidarity, a lot of mutual support, mutual aid, and street life in general. Now, before I finish up this section, I want to point out, I like to use Maslow's hierarchy of needs from psychologist Maslow, that basically talks about human needs based from the physiological basics all the way up through self-actualization. And this one points out that there's shelter and there's property, and they are separate, right? So the very basic needs we have as human beings, water, air, food, shelter, those are on the bottom rungs. Those should be the unconditionals, the things that we guarantee to all. Next rung up has safety and security needs, and on there includes property, which unfortunately in the last decades has been conflated with shelter. So this is a major issue in developing cities, that we need to separate these out and make sure that shelter is guaranteed. And there's something called the 20% rule, essentially, which is basically 20% of the population of a typical city cannot afford market rate housing wherever they are in the world. So any major city, and it can be up to 30, 40, or even more % in some cities, but the very minimum of at least 1/5 of the population cannot afford market rate housing, which makes sense because the private market, land is expensive, building is expensive. It's essentially, and it's expensive good to produce housing. And so the lowest income people in a society can't afford it. So if you go back to Maslow's hierarchy, you understand that, well, then some other way has to be provided. And in some countries, it's public housing, or it's co-ops, if it's nonprofit provided, or it's inclusionary zoning or rental assistance, whatever it is. But in the developing world, essentially, the need for shelter is provided for through informal settlements. And that's why it's not a coincidence that 24% of people in Rio live in favela communities. And so if you look at racial maps going back to the origins of favelas shortly after abolition of slavery in Brazil, if you look at racial maps of Rio, you see to this day a very strong fingerprint between the formal wealthy areas of the city that are mostly white and the informal favelas, which are mostly Black or brown. Now, I'm going to go really quickly through the next set of slides, but I thought I would maintain them because it talks a bit about our organization, Catalytic Communities. So if you're interested, it's an organization that came through a reflective exercise through my doctoral research, and it's a bit unconventional. So if you're interested in alternative ways of organizing nonprofits, I'd be happy to talk more to students about that later. But quickly going through our mission in our first decade to focus now on our organization today. Basically, everything we've done over the years supports favela organizers in their communities on the projects that they deem important to benefit their local organizing efforts. So everything we do is through the lens of traditional versus asset-based community development. We are countering the traditional approaches through an asset-based approach. So ABCD, asset-based community development, it looks at the traditional ways that development happens when government goes into especially low-income communities, the way they treat these communities as deficient, as problems, and switches it completely. We look at them through their assets. And so, for example, rather than focusing on problems, we focus on opportunities. Rather than looking at communities as a charitable project, we see them as worthy and having the right to investment. Rather than bringing in outside experts, we recognize that the real experts are the residents, and that we actually should bring in technical allies to do mutual exchange and helping and learning together. Rather than emphasis on government, the emphasis is on the community. Rather than people as beneficiaries, you understand the people as the citizens and co-creators and controllers of the development. So this approach has produced today 3 different programs that work on narrative and communications, sustainable development, and land rights. And in this presentation, I'm obviously going to focus on our project, the Sustainable Favela Network. But before I get to that, I'm going to tell you about how our organization looks at things in a cyclical way and our relationship to the SDGs. So here on this slide on the right, you can see that we currently have 3 programs that we've built over these 2 decades, and we've identified that there is a cyclical nature to them. When Catalytic Communities started, when I founded the organization 20 years ago, we were focused on grassroots organizers and supporting them in multiple ways. But what we realized 10 years in was that as long as these communities are seen as slums and precarious and based on their deficiencies and as criminal, etc., we were never going to attain the potential development that could happen in these communities. And the reason is because the government and society at large doesn't see it. And so we are going to get evictions, and we're going to get disrespect and lack of investment. So we had to go back and focused on the narrative. And so for 6-7 years, from 2010 to 2017, we did just that. And we've been working since then as well to reconstruct the narrative. So the idea is, if we change the way we perceive low-income communities that are actually full of assets that can be brought towards sustainable development, which is what I'm going to talk about a bit more in the next set of slides. But then you go to grassroots organizing and you support their organizing. And then once their communities improve, you guarantee they can stay in those communities, that they're neither going to be evicted or gentrified. And that's our 3rd program, the Favela Community Land Trust Project. Then you can actually create a cycle where you develop informal settlements like favelas in ways that honor those residents and honor their sustainable potential. Now, focusing on the SDGs, for 6 months, a couple of years ago, our team did an analysis of how our work fit in with the SDGs. And basically what we found was that we speak to all of the SDGs because we support community organizers in favela neighborhoods on all sorts of themes, on every SDG front. But as an organization, our focus is on achieving SDG 11, which is sustainable cities and communities. However, in the context of Rio, and I believe anywhere, you can't get there without social justice, which is SDG 16. So in our framework, we see SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities, as the canopy of a tree. And then we see social justice as the trunk of the tree. But also we see all the individual SDGs, clean water, et cetera, as sections of the canopy. So within our sustainable cities and communities, we need all of those sustainable attributes. And then finally, as we did this analysis, we realized there were actually missing elements because the SDG framework really seemed to be built for larger institutions and not with an eye to community organizing, which I would argue is really where we need to be investing, because communities taking control and being able to control their destinies, we can have a much more sustainable world. And so we identified 4 areas that were missing, and we realized those are really the roots to the SDGs as far as our framework is concerned. So the first one is roots and belonging. So, people being able to feel connected to where they're from. If people don't feel connected to where they're from, they don't care for that place. And we lose our understanding of the connection between the environment and place, et cetera. Number 2 is community control over development. That's absolutely critical, especially in communities that are self-built over generations. Third is direct channels to government. So government needs to be directly responsive and responsible to residents. And finally, fair, nuanced media representation, which seems sort of out of place because it's not so much involving government, but actually it is critical because in some ways, as communities are stigmatized through the media, it becomes really hard to do everything else. And so it's important that communities can speak and have a voice in the media as well. So now that I've explained a bit about our work, Catalytic Communities, and how we view sustainable, the SDGs, I'm going to focus on our main project that directly involves the SDGs and sustainable development, which is the Sustainable Favela Network. So this project started in 2012 when we created a film for the Rio +20 Environmental Summit in Brazil. And we basically reached out to our community networks, and we got 50 responses of people who were developing sustainable projects or had problems or challenges in their communities that they wanted to highlight. And we went out and filmed them. And what we came up with was essentially a film that shows that favelas have a number of these sustainable attributes that as urban planners we're trying to build into cities, although they also have a range of challenges due to historic underinvestment. And so from there, we realized that these communities were actually developing solutions to many things, but they didn't know each other. And so we realized there was a need to network local projects in the favelas that were developing sustainably. We also realized that if you compared favelas to lead neighborhoods, for example, we did this study, you could, in some cases, favelas were actually more sustainable. And so, how do we highlight all of that? How do we bring that to bear? And how do we help those communities develop more sustainably over time? And so that's when we, in 2017, began a project which has grown over these last 3 years. And we reached out and mapped all of the projects in Rio's favelas that are working on sustainability and resilience. And then we started featuring them and writing articles about them on our news site, RioOnWatch. And then we started having meetings and meetups. So we had the very first event where we brought everybody together over a day. It was incredible. And then after that, in 2019, we had a range of exchanges in different favelas, taking people to learn from each other's initiatives. And last year, we formed 7 working groups, which since then have been supporting community projects on a range of issues, from cleanups, reuse of materials, recycling, again, reuse. In this case, it's an artist that works with drumming out of reused materials, solar panels in favelas, biodigesters, so clean sewage cleaned through local technology, water societies, water irrigation through solar. These are all projects that exist in Rio's favelas, where people are organizing to be sustainable, or as sustainable as they can. Green roofs, and all sorts of cultural and memory conservation programs, environmental education programs, and so on. So in this final section, I want to talk about, okay, so this is through essentially last year, the work our organization has been doing, Catalytic Communities has been doing, finding these community organizations that are working on a variety of fronts and supporting them in their work. But this year, we found ourselves in a totally different scenario, right? So COVID-19, and how did that affect favelas? And essentially what we found is that COVID, like what did in Brazil, in Rio, what it has done all over the world, it lifts the mask on the inequalities that have always been there, but also the potential that's there. So, Brazil is the country with the second highest COVID cases in the world. And the factors that influence COVID in favelas there's a long list. There are pre-existing conditions, but then there are compounding factors that come from our current political scenario. And so as a result, we've had COVID rates through the roof. We've had people losing jobs, losing their income in favelas. The underreporting is also a big issue. So the numbers are through the roof, but the underreporting is too, which means the numbers are much higher. And so it's really affected favelas to the point where they actually have even started doing their own data collection. So one of the projects we started this year actually is a COVID-19 in favelas unified dashboard, working with a number of community organizations to produce data that contests the official data on the reach of the pandemic in the favelas. But, communities collecting their own data is just one of numerous ways that favela organizers have been building out their data collection in this period. That have been responding to the pandemic in this period. And so you have communities doing their fundraising to distribute food staples, to guarantee hygiene supplies, to lobby for water access when it's depleted, to setting up sinks in public spaces where people can wash their hands, to setting up organic connections with organic rural producers to bring food into favelas for people to access. The amount of organizing in favelas responding to the pandemic has been really incredible. And you have community organizations where before they were doing, for example, agroforestry, and now they're doing connections between rural farmers and favela residents in need. You have community groups that were full of face-to-face events supporting youth, and now they're focused completely on distributing basic foodstuffs to residents. And so the Sustainable Favela Network has also evolved in this period, and obviously responded to supporting local one another as a network. And one of the things that has been done all year is a series of public teach-ins. So community organizations teaching each other about how to access different types of resources, or how to organize, how to mobilize, talking about memory of the pandemic, all the people who are dying, and how we're going to be able to maintain those memories alive, and many other elements of the response. So once again, favelas showing themselves to be resilient, and communities full of potential. So just to conclude, if we didn't know now we know, right? First, we're all connected. What happens in one place affects us all. Something that started in a remote part of China has wreaked havoc here in Rio and around the world. Everything is connected. So by the same logic, What happens to Rio's favelas matters and impacts everyone, including those in Melbourne. We're all interconnected. Second, we're only as strong as our most vulnerable. So as long as a society maintains some people in a precarious state, we're maintaining all of us in a precarious state. There's no way to move forward without taking everyone with us. Third, supportive communities and stable homes are everything. So now everybody's been stuck back home or wherever, if they have a home, and everything is based on what they have at home and what sorts of communities of support they have around them, their outlook. So favelas, where they're very organized, you see, people with lower rates of infection, people with higher rates of access to supports, etc. And finally, communities know what needs to be done. I've been to hundreds of favela meetings over 20 years, and the three top requests that residents insist they need are water, sanitation, health, and education. And those are the same three that right now we're seeing the impacts from not having invested in. Imagine if the money we put into security were invested in those areas. Imagine where we would be now, how we would have been in this moment. So in these final couple of slides, I just want to prod, what would Rio be like if we embraced the unique history of each of the city's favelas, recognized their contribution to the city, and supported their future development in ways that honored resident knowledge and history. What would favelas in Rio be like with investment, justice, and creativity? This is a picture of Valparaíso in Chile, which is a city that was built as favelas. In fact, most of the World Heritage sites in Europe, the cities were built informally when they were built, right? So there are all these double standards embedded in the way we look at our cities today based on the income of those who are building the city or who are located in those spaces. And then finally, what if Rio set an example for the world? I mentioned earlier that a third of humanity will live in informal settlements and cities by 2050. But most of those are newly developing areas where there's no direction exactly on what to do. In Rio, we've got communities that have informally developed over multiple generations at this point, and we could really invest fully in them and integrate them into the city in ways that honored them and what they've achieved to date. And as a result, we could produce a path forward, and a path that actually values and is based and rooted in their sustainable qualities. And finally, just an invitation to all of you. Our organization is focusing on COVID reporting, sustainable favela network teach-ins, and a host of other activities. We depend on a network of volunteer interns and translators and writers and others. So feel free to reach out. For the first time, all of our internships are online. And then finally, just thank you very much for having me. Sorry if there were a couple of hiccups during the talk. I'm happy to take any questions. Please write down my email and get in touch. And thank you again for inviting me to participate.